I never thought my own father would look me straight in the eye and call me selfish and ungrateful, but that's exactly what happened during what should have been a peaceful Sunday dinner. The argument started when I finally said no to babysitting my golden stepsister Madison's 3 young children for yet another weekend. For months, I'd been providing free childcare every Friday through Sunday, while she gallivanted around town without a care in the world. When I refused to continue being her personal, unpaid nanny, my father delivered an ultimatum that would destroy our relationship forever. He told me I had 24 hours to apologize and get back in line, or he'd cut me off completely. What happened next completely shattered their illusion about who really held the power in this twisted family dynamic. My name is Pauline, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means my income fluctuates, and I have to hustle constantly to make ends meet. To understand how I ended up in this nightmare situation, I need to take you back to when my family fell apart and then got stitched back together in the most lopsided way imaginable. My parents divorced when I was 12 years old. The split was messy, filled with lawyers and custody battles that left me feeling like a pawn in their personal war. My mother moved to Oregon with her new boyfriend, leaving me with my father, Richard, in our small town outside of Denver. For 3 years, it was just the two of us figuring out how to navigate life without the woman who had held our household together. Then everything changed when my father met Diana at a church singles mixer. Diana was a widow with a 16-year-old daughter named Madison, and from the moment they walked into our lives, I could tell the family dynamics were about to shift dramatically. My father was so eager to create a new perfect family that he bent over backwards to make Diana and Madison feel welcomed and loved. Madison was everything I wasn't. She had long blonde hair that always looked like she'd just stepped out of a salon, bright blue eyes, and the kind of confidence that made adults gravitate toward her immediately. Where I was quiet and bookish, Madison was bubbly and social. Where I struggled with math and had to work hard for decent grades, Madison seemed to effortlessly excel at everything she touched. The favoritism started almost immediately after the wedding. For my 17th birthday, I received a $50 gift card to Target and a card with a generic message. 2 months later, for Madison's 19th birthday, my father bought her a brand new Honda Civic and threw a party that cost more than most people spend on their weddings. When I pointed out the inequality, my father explained that Madison was going through a difficult transition and needed extra support. College applications revealed the full extent of the preferential treatment. Despite my decent grades and involvement in the school newspaper, my father told me that money was tight and I'd need to take out student loans or find scholarships if I wanted to pursue higher education. Meanwhile, he paid for Madison's full tuition to Colorado State University, her room and board her meal plan, and even her sorority fees. When I confronted him about this obvious double standard, he said Madison had better grades and more potential for success. I worked 3 part-time jobs throughout college to pay for my education and living expenses. I delivered pizzas on weeknight evenings, worked at a coffee shop on weekend mornings, and did freelance graphic design whenever I could find clients. Meanwhile, Madison breezed through her communications degree without ever having to worry about money. She spent her summers traveling to Europe and her spring breaks in Cancun, all funded by our parents. After college, the pattern continued. Madison landed a job at a local marketing firm through connections my father had made for her. When she wanted to buy a house at 24, my father co-signed her mortgage and helped with the down payment. When I needed help with the security deposit for my tiny studio apartment, he told me it was time I learned to be financially independent. Madison met her husband Jake at work, and their wedding was a fairy tale affair that cost $30,000. My father walked her down the aisle with tears of pride in his eyes, giving a toast about how honored he was to have such an accomplished daughter. When I started dating my college boyfriend seriously, my father barely acknowledged the relationship and certainly never offered to help with any wedding planning or expenses. Now Madison is 26 years old with 3 children under the age of 6. She has 4-year-old twins named Emma and Ethan, who are energetic and demanding in the way that most preschoolers can be. Her youngest is 18-month-old baby Sophia, who is still adjusting to sleeping through the night and requires constant attention. Madison's house is a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in the nicest neighborhood in town, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn and a swing set that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The babysitting requests started innocently enough about 8 months ago. Madison called me on a Thursday evening sounding frazzled and exhausted. She explained that Jake had surprised her with dinner reservations at an expensive restaurant for their anniversary, but their usual babysitter had canceled at the last minute. Could I possibly watch the kids for just a few hours on Friday night? She promised it would be quick and easy. I agreed because I genuinely wanted to help my stepsister and spend time with my nieces and nephew. The evening went reasonably well, though the twins were more rambunctious than I expected, and baby Sophia cried for most of the night. Madison and Jake returned home around midnight, gushing about their romantic dinner and thanking me profusely for the favor. What started as an occasional emergency babysitting request quickly escalated into a regular weekly commitment. Madison began calling me every Wednesday to ask if I could watch the children that upcoming weekend. The requests grew longer and more demanding. What had been a few hours on Friday night became Friday evening through Sunday afternoon. Madison would drop the kids off around 5 o'clock on Friday with diaper bags and overnight supplies, then disappear until late Sunday evening. The children are not easy to manage. Emma and Ethan have learned that they can get away with almost anything because Madison refuses to discipline them consistently. They throw tantrums when they don't get their way, refuse to eat the meals I prepare, and constantly test boundaries. Baby Sophia is still in diapers and requires feeding every few hours, including throughout the night. By Sunday evening, I'm completely exhausted and have accomplished none of my own weekend tasks or personal goals. Madison never offered to pay me for these extensive babysitting services, despite knowing that I struggle financially as a freelance designer. When I hesitantly brought up the topic of compensation a few months ago, she laughed and said that family doesn't charge family for helping out. She reminded me how lucky I was to spend quality time with the children and suggested that the experience would be good practice for when I eventually have kids of my own. The breaking point should have come months ago, but I kept telling myself that family means making sacrifices for each other. I canceled dates, missed social events with friends, and turned down potential work opportunities because I was committed to watching Madison's children every single weekend. My own life started to feel like it was on hold, revolving entirely around my stepsister's needs and schedule. Then last month, I discovered something that made my blood boil with anger and betrayal. I was scrolling through social media when I saw a post from one of Madison's friends thanking her for recommending such a wonderful babysitter. The post included a photo of a woman I'd never met playing with children I didn't recognize. Curious, I clicked through to read the comments and discovered that Madison had been advertising my babysitting services to her social circle, charging $15 per hour per child for my time. Madison had been telling her friends that I was a professional childcare provider who loved working with kids and offered flexible scheduling. She was pocketing between $45 and $60 per hour, while I provided free labor, and she never mentioned that I was her stepsister or that I wasn't actually aware of this business arrangement. When I calculated the math, I realized that Madison had probably made several $100s by essentially renting out my time and energy without my knowledge or consent. After discovering Madison's secret babysitting business, I should have confronted her immediately and put an end to the exploitation. Instead, I convinced myself that maybe there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps her friends had misinterpreted casual comments about my willingness to help with childcare. I decided to give Madison the benefit of the doubt and continue with our weekend arrangement while paying closer attention to any suspicious behavior. The requests became increasingly unreasonable over the following weeks. What had started as occasional evening babysitting had morphed into full weekend commitments that left me feeling like a live-in nanny. Madison would call me on Thursday evenings with elaborate plans for her upcoming weekend adventures, casually mentioning that she'd need me to watch the kids from Friday evening until Sunday night. These weren't emergency situations or special occasions anymore. Madison was treating me like her personal childcare service for routine activities like shopping trips, spa days, and social gatherings. She would drop off Emma Ethan and baby Sophia with minimal instructions and maximum expectations. The children came with bags full of supplies, but Madison never included enough diapers formula or appropriate clothing for the extended stays. The kids' behavior grew more challenging as they became accustomed to spending entire weekends at my small apartment. Emma and Ethan started referring to my place as their second home and began leaving toys, books, and personal belongings scattered throughout my living space. They expected me to have their favorite snacks available and threw dramatic tantrums when I couldn't provide the specific brands or flavors they preferred. Baby Sophia's sleep schedule was completely disrupted by these frequent overnight stays. She would cry for hours on Friday nights, missing her familiar crib and normal bedtime routine. I spent countless midnight hours pacing around my apartment with a screaming infant trying to soothe her while the twins complained about being kept awake. By Saturday morning, all four of us were exhausted and cranky. Madison never acknowledged the physical and emotional toll these extended babysitting sessions took on me. She would breeze in on Sunday evenings perfectly refreshed from her weekend of relaxation and cheerfully collect her children without asking how things had gone or whether I needed any support. She acted as though I should be grateful for the opportunity to bond with my nieces and nephew, completely ignoring the fact that I was sacrificing my own life for her convenience. My freelance graphic design work began suffering because I couldn't focus on client projects during the weekends when the children were with me. I missed deadlines, turned down lucrative opportunities, and lost potential long-term contracts because I wasn't available for meetings or consultations on Saturdays and Sundays. My income dropped significantly, but Madison seemed oblivious to the financial impact her demands were having on my career. Dating became virtually impossible when every weekend was consumed by childcare responsibilities. I had to cancel romantic dinners, skip social events, and decline invitations to parties or gatherings. When I was interested in suggested weekend activities, I had to explain that I was unavailable due to family commitments. Several promising relationships fizzled out because potential partners assumed I wasn't truly interested in spending time with them. My friendships also suffered under the strain of constant babysitting obligations. Friends stopped inviting me to weekend brunches, shopping trips, or hiking adventures because they knew I'd have to decline. I felt increasingly isolated and resentful watching my social circle shrink while Madison's social life expanded with the help of my free labor. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Madison started extending her trips without advance notice. She would call me on Saturday afternoon to casually mention that she and Jake had decided to stay an extra night at wherever they were visiting. These spontaneous extensions meant that I had to rearrange my own plans and purchase additional supplies for the children without any reimbursement or apology. One particularly frustrating weekend, Madison dropped off the kids on Friday for what was supposed to be a single overnight stay. She claimed she and Jake had concert tickets and would return by Saturday evening. Instead, she called Saturday morning to inform me that they'd decided to make a romantic weekend out of the trip and would be back on Sunday. Then Sunday afternoon brought another call pushing their return to Monday morning because they'd met some friends and wanted to extend the celebration. I spent 3 days caring for 3 young children in my tiny one-bedroom apartment without adequate supplies or preparation. The twins missed their swimming lessons and a birthday party they'd been excited about attending. Baby Sophia developed a mild fever that had me worried enough to consider calling a doctor, but I couldn't reach Madison for guidance about medications or emergency contacts. When Madison finally returned Monday evening, she seemed annoyed that I was upset about the extended timeline and lack of communication. The final straw came when I realized that Madison had been systematically manipulating the children's understanding of our arrangement. During one of our weekend stays, 4-year-old Emma looked up at me with her big blue eyes and said that Mommy had told her that watching them was my job because I didn't have a real family of my own. Ethan chimed in to add that Mommy had explained that I was their second mommy and that taking care of them was what made me happy. I was horrified to realize that Madison had been teaching her children to see me as a built-in caregiver, rather than their aunt who was helping out of love and kindness. She'd created an expectation in their young minds that my time and energy belonged to them by default, rather than being a generous gift from someone who cared about their well-being. The children had started making demands rather than requests, assuming that I would automatically accommodate their preferences and schedules. Baby Sophia had begun reaching for me immediately when Madison dropped her off, as if she expected me to take over parenting duties, without question. While part of me was touched by her trust and affection, I was disturbed by the realization that Madison was essentially training her children to see me as an alternate parent figure, rather than an extended family member who occasionally provided support. The psychological manipulation became even clearer when Emma asked me why I didn't have children of my own if I was so good at taking care of them. When I explained that I wasn't married and hadn't decided whether I wanted to become a mother, she innocently repeated something Madison had obviously told her, that some people are born to take care of other people's children because that's their special purpose in life. I realized that Madison had been filling her children's heads with the narrative that I was naturally suited for childcare, and that providing this service was my primary contribution to the family. She'd essentially convinced them that I existed to support their needs and preferences rather than being an independent adult with my own goals, dreams, and relationships to prioritize. The weekend that finally shattered my tolerance for Madison's exploitation began on a crisp Friday evening in late October. I'd been looking forward to a rare weekend without babysitting duties because Madison hadn't called with her usual Thursday evening request. I'd made plans to attend a networking event for local graphic designers on Saturday morning, followed by a lunch date with a man I'd been seeing for a few weeks. Sunday was reserved for catching up on client work and enjoying some much-needed solitude. Those plans evaporated when Madison showed up at my apartment door at 6 o'clock Friday evening with all 3 children in tow, looking frazzled and slightly desperate. She explained that Jake had surprised her with last-minute reservations at a romantic bed and breakfast about 2 hours away, and their regular babysitter had come down with the flu. Could I possibly watch the kids just for tonight? She promised they'd be back by noon on Saturday and she'd make it up to me somehow. Against my better judgment, I agreed to help because Madison seemed genuinely stressed, and I didn't want to be responsible for ruining their romantic getaway. She quickly transferred car seats, diaper bags, and overnight supplies while rattling off basic instructions about bedtimes and meal preferences. The children seemed excited about their impromptu sleepover, and I convinced myself that one night of babysitting wouldn't derail my weekend plans too dramatically. Madison and Jake drove off in their SUV, waving cheerfully as they headed toward their romantic retreat. I settled in for what I expected to be a relatively calm evening with Emma, Ethan, and baby Sophia. The twins were initially cooperative, playing with toys I'd accumulated during previous visits while I prepared their dinner and got Sophia situated with her bottle and snacks. The problems began around midnight when both twins started complaining of stomach aches. Within an hour, they were taking turns vomiting in my bathroom while running low-grade fevers. Baby Sophia seemed to be developing similar symptoms, becoming fussy and refusing her bottle. I spent the entire night cleaning up messes, taking temperatures, and trying to keep everyone hydrated while they battled what appeared to be a stomach bug. By Saturday morning, all 3 children were sick and miserable. The twins couldn't keep food down, and Sophia was having digestive issues that required constant diaper changes and careful monitoring. I called Madison multiple times throughout the morning, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I left detailed messages explaining the situation and asking for guidance about medications, doctor contacts, and when she planned to return. Madison finally called me back around noon, sounding relaxed and slightly annoyed by my interruption. When I explained that all 3 children had stomach flu and needed their mother's care, she sighed heavily and said she'd try to cut the trip short. However, she mentioned that they'd already paid for both nights at the bed and breakfast, and Jake was really looking forward to the couple's massage they'd booked for Sunday morning. Could I possibly handle things for just one more night? I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and frustrated by her casual attitude toward her children's illness. The twins were crying for their mommy baby. Sophia needed more specialized care than I could provide, and I'd already canceled my networking event and lunch date. When I insisted that she needed to come home immediately, Madison became defensive and accused me of overreacting to a simple stomach bug. The conversation escalated when I pointed out that I wasn't qualified to make medical decisions for her children, and that they clearly needed their parents during their illness. Madison dismissed my concerns, saying that kids get sick all the time, and that I was being dramatic. She suggested giving them bland foods and plenty of fluids, as if I hadn't already been doing exactly that for the past 12 hours. I spent Saturday night caring for 3 sick children in my small apartment, feeling increasingly angry and resentful about Madison's selfish behavior. The twins were too weak to play or engage in normal activities, and baby Sophia required almost constant attention as her symptoms worsened. I couldn't sleep because someone was crying, vomiting, or needing comfort every few hours throughout the night. Sunday morning brought another frustrating phone call from Madison. Instead of rushing home to care for her sick children, she cheerfully announced that she and Jake had decided to extend their romantic getaway through Sunday night. They discovered a cute little town near the bed and breakfast and wanted to explore the local shops and restaurants. She'd be home Monday morning, refreshed and ready to take over with the kids. I was furious. Here I was dealing with 3 sick children who needed their mother's comfort and care, while Madison was gallivanting around tourist shops without a care in the world. When I angrily pointed out that her children had been asking for her all weekend and were genuinely unwell, she laughed and said kids are resilient and would be fine with their favorite aunt taking care of them. The final insult came when Madison mentioned that she'd been posting photos on Instagram throughout their extended romantic weekend. While I was cleaning up vomit and monitoring fevers, she was enjoying spa treatments, gourmet meals, and scenic hiking trails. She'd been documenting every moment of her relaxing getaway while leaving me to handle the crisis she'd dumped in my lap. Madison finally returned Monday evening around 9 o'clock, looking tan-rested and completely refreshed from her extended vacation. She walked into my apartment carrying shopping bags full of expensive clothing and artisanal souvenirs, barely glancing at her children who ran to greet her with obvious relief. When I tried to explain how difficult the weekend had been, she waved off my concerns and said she'd known I could handle anything that came up. She spent less than 10 minutes collecting her children's belongings and loading them into car seats, seemingly oblivious to my exhaustion and frustration. As she was leaving, she casually mentioned that she'd need me to watch the kids again the following weekend because she and Jake had tickets to a concert series. When I hesitated, she smiled and said she knew she could count on me because I was such a natural with children. After they left, I sat in my quiet apartment surrounded by the aftermath of the weekend from hell. Dirty sheets needed washing, toys were scattered everywhere, and my entire living space smelled like sick children and cleaning products. I'd lost a potentially valuable networking opportunity, canceled a promising romantic date, and spent 3 days feeling like an unpaid emergency babysitter rather than a caring family member. But the discovery that truly broke my spirit came when I checked social media that evening. Madison had posted a series of Instagram photos from their spontaneous spa weekend, showing herself and Jake enjoying couples massages, gourmet dinners, and scenic hikes. The captions were full of hearts and gratitude for their amazing romantic getaway, with several comments from friends expressing envy about their perfect relationship and adventurous lifestyle. Meanwhile, I found text messages Madison had sent to various family members throughout the weekend, explaining that she was helping during a family emergency while I dealt with sick children. She'd portrayed herself as a devoted mother who was reluctantly taking a much-needed break while her responsible stepsister handled a minor crisis. The texts painted me as eager to help and completely capable of managing any situation rather than an overwhelmed woman who'd been abandoned during a childcare emergency. The Monday evening after the disastrous sick children weekend, I knew I couldn't continue enabling Madison's exploitation and manipulation. I'd spent 3 sleepless nights caring for her sick children while she enjoyed a spa retreat, and her casual dismissal of my concerns had finally pushed me past my breaking point. I decided to confront her directly about the lies, the secret babysitting business, and the complete disregard for my own life and well-being. I called Madison Tuesday morning after I'd had some time to process the weekend and organize my thoughts. I wanted to approach the conversation calmly and rationally, rather than lashing out in anger, even though I was furious about how she'd handled the situation. When she answered the phone, she sounded chipper and relaxed, probably still basking in the afterglow of her romantic getaway. I started by asking how the children were feeling and whether they'd fully recovered from their stomach bug. Madison casually mentioned that they seemed fine, though Emma had stayed home from preschool as a precaution. She thanked me again for handling everything so well over the weekend, adding that she'd known I would rise to the occasion because I was such a capable and caring person. Then I brought up the Instagram photos and asked why she'd been posting happy vacation pictures while her children were sick and asking for their mommy. Madison's tone shifted slightly as she explained that she hadn't wanted to worry her social media followers with negative posts about sick kids. She said the photos were from earlier in the weekend before she'd known about the children's illness, and that she'd simply delayed posting them until after the crisis was over. I pointed out that the metadata on the photos showed they'd been taken throughout Sunday, long after she'd known about the stomach bug situation. Madison became defensive, saying she didn't appreciate me stalking her social media and analyzing the timestamps of her personal posts. She accused me of being overly dramatic about a simple stomach virus and suggested that I was jealous of her romantic relationship with Jake. The conversation escalated when I mentioned the text messages she'd sent to family members portraying the weekend as a family emergency that she was heroically managing from a distance. Madison claimed there had been a miscommunication and that she'd simply wanted to keep everyone informed about the children's condition. When I pointed out that her messages made it sound like she was actively helping rather than enjoying a spa vacation, she became irritated and accused me of nitpicking her communication style. Then I brought up the real issue that had been eating away at me for months, the discovery that she'd been charging her friends for my babysitting services without my knowledge or consent. I asked her to explain why several of her social media contacts had thanked her for recommending such a wonderful childcare provider and why she'd been advertising my services at $15 per hour per child. Madison's response revealed the depth of her entitlement and manipulation. She didn't deny the charges or express any remorse for essentially pimping out my time and energy. Instead, she explained that her friends had been complaining about difficulty finding reliable babysitters, and she'd simply mentioned that I was available and enjoyed working with children. When they'd offered to pay for my services, she'd accepted the money on my behalf and planned to surprise me with the payments later. I asked why she'd never mentioned these paid babysitting arrangements or given me any of the money she'd collected. Madison claimed that she'd been saving the payments as a surprise gift for my birthday or Christmas, wanting to show her appreciation for all my help with her own children. She suggested that I was being ungrateful and suspicious by questioning her motives, especially when she'd been trying to do something nice for me. The lies were so transparent and insulting that I lost my composure. I pointed out that my birthday had passed 3 months earlier, without any surprise payment or acknowledgement of the money she'd collected. I also mentioned that she'd never asked my permission to advertise my services or discussed my availability with potential clients. Madison had essentially been running a small business using my labor without any input or consent from me. Madison's defensive strategy shifted to playing the victim. She claimed that I was being unreasonable and hurtful by attacking her generosity and family loyalty. She reminded me of all the times she'd included me in family activities and made me feel welcome in their home. According to her version of events, she'd been trying to help me build a babysitting clientele, while also supporting her friends who needed reliable childcare. When I pointed out that she'd never offered to pay me for watching her own children during my countless weekend commitments, Madison became indignant. She said that family doesn't charge family for acts of love and service. She reminded me that I'd always seemed happy to spend time with Emma Ethan and baby Sophia, and that I'd never mentioned wanting financial compensation for helping with childcare. I explained that there's a significant difference between occasionally helping family members and being expected to provide free professional services every single weekend. Madison had turned me into her personal unpaid nanny while charging others for the same services, creating a system where everyone benefited financially except the person actually doing the work. The conversation reached its climax when Madison accused me of being jealous of her happy family life and successful marriage. She suggested that I was looking for reasons to criticize her because I was bitter about being single and childless at 28. According to Madison, I should be grateful for the opportunity to spend time with children and gain experience that would help me in my own future relationships. This accusation was particularly painful because it revealed how little Madison understood or respected my life choices. I'd been prioritizing my career and personal growth rather than rushing into marriage and motherhood, but she viewed my independence as a character flaw that needed to be fixed through involuntary childcare experience. I firmly told Madison that I would no longer be available for weekend babysitting duties, effective immediately. I explained that I needed to focus on my own career and relationships rather than providing free childcare services that were preventing me from building the life I wanted. Madison could find paid babysitters or adjust her social calendar to accommodate her responsibilities as a mother. Madison's reaction was swift and dramatic. She accused me of abandoning her children when they needed family support the most. She claimed that I was being selfish and ungrateful after everything she and Jake had done to welcome me into their family. According to Madison, I was punishing innocent children because of some perceived slight that existed only in my imagination. She threatened to tell our parents about my unreasonable demands and selfish attitude. Madison said she'd always known I was jealous of her relationship with our father, and that this babysitting conflict was just another example of my inability to be happy for family members who were more successful and fulfilled than I was. The phone call ended with Madison hanging up on me after declaring that she'd never ask me for help again since I'd made it clear that I didn't care about her children's well-being or our family relationships. Within minutes, I could see her typing angry messages on social media and knew that she was already crafting her version of events to share with mutual friends and family members. I felt a mixture of relief and dread as I processed the confrontation. Relief because I'd finally stood up for myself and set clear boundaries about the exploitation that had been consuming my life for months. Dread because I knew Madison would retaliate by painting me as the villain in this story, and that our family dynamics were about to become significantly more complicated and painful. Less than an hour after my confrontation with Madison ended, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. My father's name appeared on the screen, and I could tell from his tone before he even spoke that Madison had already reached him with her version of the events. Richard's voice was cold and disappointed in a way that brought back painful memories of childhood lectures about responsibility and family loyalty. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or ask for my side of the story. Instead, he launched immediately into a speech about how ashamed and disgusted he was by my behavior toward Madison and the children. According to the story he'd been told, I had cruelly abandoned 3 sick children during a family emergency, and then attacked their mother with unreasonable demands and accusations when she returned from helping with the crisis. I tried to interrupt and explain what had actually happened over the weekend, but Richard cut me off with an irritated sigh. He said he didn't want to hear excuses or justifications for what he considered inexcusable behavior toward innocent children who loved and trusted me. In his mind, Madison had been dealing with a childcare emergency while I threw tantrums about compensation and made selfish demands that put my own convenience above family obligations. The conversation grew more heated as Richard explained his perspective on family relationships and mutual support. He reminded me that Madison had always been welcoming and generous, including me in holiday celebrations, and treating me like a real sister rather than just a stepsister. According to him, I was being ungrateful and petty by refusing to help during times of need, especially when Madison had never asked for anything unreasonable or taken advantage of my willingness to assist. When I mentioned the money Madison had been collecting by charging her friends for my babysitting services, Richard dismissed it as a misunderstanding that I was blowing out of proportion. He suggested that Madison had probably been planning to share those payments with me eventually, and that I was being paranoid and suspicious by assuming malicious intent. Family members should give each other the benefit of the doubt, rather than looking for reasons to feel victimized or exploited. I explained that I'd been providing free childcare every single weekend for months, while Madison enjoyed an active social life funded by my unpaid labor. Richard's response revealed just how skewed his perception of the situation had become. He said that spending time with nieces and nephews was a privilege, not a burden, and that most people would be honored to play such an important role in children's lives. According to Richard, I was being selfish and short-sighted by prioritizing my own entertainment and career goals over family relationships that would last a lifetime. He reminded me that Madison was a hard-working mother who deserved support from extended family members, especially those who didn't have children of their own to occupy their time and energy. The conversation took an even more painful turn when Richard began comparing me unfavorably to Madison in terms of character and life accomplishments. He pointed out that Madison had successfully balanced marriage, motherhood, and career responsibilities while maintaining close family relationships. Meanwhile, I was still single at 28, struggling financially as a freelance designer, and apparently unable to maintain healthy family connections due to my self-centered attitude. This comparison stung deeply because it revealed how Richard viewed my life choices and priorities. Instead of respecting my focus on building a career and maintaining independence, he saw my single status and financial struggles as evidence of personal failures that made me less valuable than Madison's traditional family structure and suburban success. When I tried to explain that Madison's lifestyle was partially subsidized by the free childcare I provided, Richard became angry and defensive. He accused me of being jealous of Madison's happiness and looking for ways to undermine her success. According to him, I was using petty complaints about babysitting to mask deeper resentment about Madison's achievements in areas where I had apparently failed. The ultimatum came after nearly 30 minutes of increasingly hostile conversation. Richard's voice became formal and cold as he outlined my options with military precision. I had exactly 24 hours to call Madison, offer a sincere apology for my unreasonable behavior, and commit to resuming my regular childcare assistance whenever she needed support with the children. If I chose to apologize and return to my previous role as the helpful stepsister, Richard would consider the matter closed, and we could move forward as a family. However, if I continued to be stubborn and selfish about my responsibilities to Madison and the children, he would have no choice but to reevaluate my place in the family structure. The threat was clear: apologize and submit to Madison's demands, or face complete rejection from the only parent I had left. Richard explained that he couldn't continue supporting someone who refused to contribute positively to family harmony and relationships. He'd raised me to be a caring and generous person, and my recent behavior suggested that I'd lost sight of those values in favor of selfish pursuits. When I asked what he meant by reevaluating my place in the family, Richard became even more specific about the consequences of defying his ultimatum. He would cut off all financial support, including the occasional help with car repairs or medical expenses that had provided a small safety net during my freelance career struggles. More importantly, he would stop considering me a daughter and family member, effectively disowning me for refusing to fulfill my obligations to Madison and her children. The conversation ended with Richard explaining that he'd built a beautiful blended family with Diana and Madison, and he wouldn't allow me to destroy that harmony with petty complaints and unreasonable demands. I had until the same time tomorrow evening to make my decision and call him with my choice. He hoped I would come to my senses and remember the values he'd tried to instill in me throughout my childhood. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence trying to process what had just happened. My father had essentially given me an ultimatum to continue being exploited by Madison or lose my family entirely. He dismissed my legitimate concerns about being taken advantage of and instead painted me as a jealous troublemaker who was attacking an innocent mother and her children. But the most devastating revelation came buried in Richard's angry lecture about family finances and support. Almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that I shouldn't expect the same level of financial assistance that Madison received, because their situations were different and Madison had greater responsibilities as a mother and wife. When I pressed him to explain what he meant, Richard revealed information that shattered my understanding of the family financial dynamics. For the past 3 years, he'd been secretly paying Madison's mortgage payments because Jake's income wasn't sufficient to cover their housing costs. He'd also been making her car payments and providing monthly allowances to help with childcare and household expenses. While I'd been struggling to pay off student loans and build my freelance business without any family support, Richard had been subsidizing Madison's entire lifestyle to the tune of several $1,000s per month. The beautiful house, the new cars, the frequent date nights and weekend getaways had all been funded through secret financial support that I'd never known existed. Richard justified this disparity by explaining that Madison had children to support and deserved help maintaining stability for her family. Meanwhile, I was a single adult who should be capable of supporting myself without ongoing parental assistance. The irony was lost on him that Madison's ability to maintain her perfect lifestyle was partially dependent on both his secret financial support and my unpaid childcare services. The revelation explained so much about the family dynamics I'd never understood. Madison's confidence and entitlement made sense when I realized she'd never actually experienced financial stress or independence. Her casual attitude toward my time and energy was easier to understand when I knew she'd been receiving thousands of dollars in family support, while I'd been told to figure things out on my own. I realized that Richard's ultimatum wasn't really about family harmony or children's well-being. It was about protecting an elaborate system of favoritism and financial support that kept Madison's perfect life afloat, while positioning me as the free labor that made their arrangement possible. My refusal to continue providing unpaid childcare threatened to expose just how much assistance Madison required to maintain her facade of success and independence. The 24 hours Richard had given me to decide my fate felt both endless and impossibly short. I spent Tuesday night and most of Wednesday alternating between anger, grief, and a strange sense of relief that the family dynamics I'd struggled with for years were finally being exposed in their full, ugly truth. By Wednesday afternoon, I knew what I had to do, even though it would cost me the only parent I had left. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to earn Richard's approval and acceptance, constantly hoping that if I just worked harder or needed less or caused fewer problems, he might start treating me with the same love and respect he automatically gave Madison. The ultimatum forced me to confront the painful reality that his love had always been conditional, based on my willingness to serve his golden child, rather than any inherent value I possessed as his daughter. Making the decision to cut contact wasn't really about choosing between my own well-being and family relationships. It was about finally accepting that I'd never actually had the family relationships I'd been desperately trying to preserve. Richard had made it clear that my role in his life was to support Madison's needs and preferences, not to exist as an independent person with my own goals and boundaries. Wednesday evening, exactly 24 hours after Richard's ultimatum, I called him back with my answer. When he picked up the phone, his voice carried a tone of expectant satisfaction, as if he already knew I'd chosen to apologize and submit to his demands. He probably assumed that the threat of losing my family would be enough to bring me back in line with his expectations. Instead, I told him that I wouldn't be apologizing to Madison or resuming unpaid babysitting duties. I explained that I'd finally understood the true nature of our family relationships and that I couldn't continue participating in a system where my value was determined solely by my willingness to serve others without expecting respect or consideration in return. Richard's reaction was swift and brutal. He told me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life by choosing selfishness over family loyalty. According to him, I would regret this decision for the rest of my life when I realized how much I'd given up for petty complaints about helping with childcare. He predicted that I'd end up alone and bitter, having destroyed relationships with people who truly cared about me because of my inability to think about anyone other than myself. I let him finish his speech about my character flaws and poor judgment before calmly explaining that I was prepared to accept the consequences of setting healthy boundaries. I told him that losing relationships built on exploitation and conditional love wasn't actually a loss at all, but rather an opportunity to build authentic connections with people who valued me as a complete person. The conversation ended with Richard officially disowning me as his daughter and warning me not to contact him or Madison again unless I was ready to apologize and make amends for my selfish behavior. He said he'd inform Diana and the rest of the extended family about my choice to abandon my responsibilities and that I shouldn't expect anyone to support my decision to prioritize my own interests over family harmony. After hanging up, I immediately began taking practical steps to protect myself from further manipulation and harassment. I changed my phone number and blocked Richard, Madison, and Jake on all social media platforms. I didn't want to give them opportunities to continue pressuring me or attempting to guilt me into returning to their exploitative arrangement. Finding a new apartment became my top priority because I knew Madison had keys to my current place and wouldn't hesitate to use them for surprise visits or dramatic confrontations. I'd been saving money for months with the goal of upgrading my living situation, and this crisis provided the motivation I needed to actually make the move across town to a larger space in a different neighborhood. The new apartment was a one-bedroom unit in a complex that offered better security and amenities than my previous studio. More importantly, it represented a fresh start in a location where Madison couldn't just show up unannounced with her children and expect me to provide emergency babysitting services. The distance felt symbolic as well as practical, creating physical space that matched the emotional boundaries I was finally learning to maintain. I threw myself into my graphic design work with an intensity I hadn't felt in months. Without weekend babysitting obligations consuming my time and energy, I was able to take on additional projects and focus on building relationships with higher-paying clients. The increased income helped offset any financial support I'd been receiving from Richard, though I quickly realized that his assistance had been more psychological than practical. Starting therapy felt like a crucial step in processing the years of emotional manipulation and favoritism I'd endured. My therapist helped me recognize patterns of behavior that I'd normalized because they'd been present throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Learning to identify manipulation tactics and emotional exploitation gave me tools for building healthier relationships in the future. The therapy sessions also helped me work through the grief and anger surrounding my father's rejection. While I'd made the right choice for my own well-being, losing my relationship with Richard still felt like a significant loss that required time and support to process fully. My therapist helped me understand that grieving the family relationships I'd hoped to have was different from regretting the boundaries I'd established to protect myself. 3 weeks after cutting contact, I received an unexpected phone call from Diana Madison's mother and my former stepmother. Her voice sounded tired and stressed as she explained that she'd been thinking about the family conflict and wanted to share some information that might help me understand what had been happening behind the scenes. Diana revealed that she'd been documenting Madison's lies and manipulative behavior for several months because she'd become increasingly concerned about patterns she was observing. As Madison's mother, she'd initially tried to dismiss the warning signs and make excuses for behavior that she knew was becoming problematic. According to Diana, Madison had been lying to everyone in the family about various aspects of her life and relationships. The babysitting arrangement with me was just one example of how Madison manipulated situations to her advantage while portraying herself as a victim or hero, depending on what served her purposes best. Diana had been keeping notes about discrepancies in Madison's stories because she'd started to worry that her daughter might have developed serious issues with honesty and empathy. The documentation included screenshots of social media posts that contradicted statements Madison had made to family members, as well as records of financial requests that didn't match the explanations Madison had provided about her needs. Most importantly, Diana had witnessed Madison coaching her children to make specific statements about me and our babysitting arrangement. She'd overheard Madison telling Emma and Ethan that I was their second mommy and that taking care of them was my special job. Diana had been horrified by the realization that Madison was manipulating her own children's understanding of family relationships to justify her exploitation of my time and kindness. Diana apologized for not speaking up sooner about Madison's behavior patterns. She explained that she'd been afraid of causing family conflict and had hoped that Madison would recognize her mistakes and change her approach to relationships. However, watching the situation escalate to the point where I felt forced to cut contact with the family had convinced Diana that her silence had been enabling harmful behavior rather than protecting family harmony. The months following my decision to cut contact with my father and Madison became a period of remarkable personal and professional growth. Without the constant drain of weekend babysitting obligations and family drama, I discovered energy and motivation that I'd forgotten I possessed. My graphic design business began thriving in ways I hadn't thought possible when my schedule was dominated by unpaid childcare duties. The first major breakthrough came when I was finally able to attend networking events and industry conferences on weekends. These professional gatherings had been completely inaccessible when I was committed to watching Madison's children every Friday through Sunday. Now I could build relationships with potential clients, learn about new design trends, and establish myself within the local creative community. One particularly valuable networking event led to a connection with Sarah, the marketing director for a growing tech startup downtown. We struck up a conversation about brand identity design, and she mentioned that her company was looking for a freelancer who could help develop their visual marketing materials. What started as a casual conversation evolved into a long-term contract that significantly increased my monthly income. The financial stability from consistent freelance work allowed me to invest in better equipment and software for my design business. I purchased a high-end computer system, professional design software subscriptions, and a larger monitor that made detailed work much more efficient. These improvements enhanced the quality of my output and enabled me to take on more complex projects that commanded higher rates. My social life experienced an equally dramatic transformation once I was available for weekend activities again. Friends who had stopped inviting me to events because of my constant babysitting commitments began including me in their plans. I rediscovered the joy of spontaneous dinner plans, hiking trips, and social gatherings that didn't require weeks of advance planning around Madison's schedule. Through one of these renewed friendships, I met Marcus at a community art fair where I was displaying some of my design work. He was there with his students from the elementary school where he taught 4th grade, and I was immediately drawn to his patient and enthusiastic interaction with the children. Unlike Madison's entitled and demanding kids, these students were respectful and curious about the creative process. Marcus and I started talking about art education and the importance of exposing children to creative thinking and problem-solving skills. His passion for teaching and genuine care for his students' development impressed me deeply. Here was someone who had chosen to work with children because he loved helping them learn and grow, not because he wanted to exploit free labor from family members. Our first official date was a Saturday afternoon visit to the Denver Art Museum, followed by dinner at a small restaurant downtown. I'd forgotten how wonderful it felt to spend a weekend evening focused on getting to know someone new rather than cleaning up after someone else's children. Marcus was interested in my design work, my goals for the future, and my thoughts on various topics that had nothing to do with childcare or family obligations. The relationship developed naturally over several months as we discovered shared interests in hiking, cooking, and exploring local arts and culture events. Marcus respected my independence and career ambitions rather than viewing them as obstacles to overcome or character flaws that needed correction. He supported my decision to prioritize professional growth and personal boundaries, understanding that these choices reflected strength rather than selfishness. More importantly, Marcus had healthy relationships with his own family members that served as examples of how relatives could support each other without exploitation or manipulation. His parents treated him and his siblings as independent adults with different strengths and challenges, offering help when requested, but not demanding specific forms of service or submission in return. The contrast between Marcus's family dynamics and the toxic relationships I'd escaped became even more apparent during holiday celebrations. His family gatherings involved genuine mutual support and respect, with everyone contributing according to their abilities and availability. No one was designated as the default caregiver or expected to sacrifice their own goals to serve others' convenience. My therapy sessions during this period focused on recognizing and celebrating the positive changes in my life, while continuing to process the grief and anger from my family relationships. My therapist helped me understand that building a healthy life after leaving toxic relationships requires both practical changes and emotional healing that takes time to develop fully. One of the most significant realizations from therapy was understanding how much my self-worth had been tied to my willingness to serve others, even when that service came at great personal cost. Learning to value my own time, energy, and goals as much as I valued other people's needs was a fundamental shift that affected every aspect of my decision-making and relationship building. The professional growth continued as my reputation in the local design community expanded through word-of-mouth referrals and successful project completions. I began getting calls from potential clients who had seen my work for other businesses and wanted similar brand development services. The referral network that developed organically felt much more sustainable and authentic than trying to build a career around other people's schedules and demands. By the end of my first year without family babysitting obligations, my income had nearly doubled compared to the previous year when weekends were consumed by unpaid childcare. The financial independence gave me confidence and security that I'd never experienced before, proving that my decision to prioritize my own career had been both personally and practically beneficial. The relationship with Marcus deepened as we supported each other through various challenges and celebrated each other's successes. He understood my commitment to maintaining independence and building my career, while I appreciated his dedication to his students and his teaching profession. We built a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values rather than dependency or obligation. 8 months after cutting contact with my family, I realized that I hadn't missed the constant drama and manipulation that had previously consumed so much of my emotional energy. The peace and stability of my new life felt like a luxury I'd never known I was missing until I finally experienced it consistently. The most unexpected development came when an elite design agency downtown called to offer me a position as their senior graphic designer. The opportunity had emerged through networking connections I'd built during weekend industry events, and the timing was perfect because I was no longer tied down by family obligations that would have made their schedule requirements impossible to meet. 6 months after I'd cut all contact with my father in Madison, I was settling into my new routine and feeling genuinely happy with the life I'd built. My design business was thriving. My relationship with Marcus was growing stronger, and I'd established a circle of friends who respected my boundaries and appreciated my friendship. The peace and stability felt like a gift I'd given myself by choosing self-respect over toxic family relationships. That tranquility was interrupted on a Tuesday evening in April when Diana called me from a number I didn't recognize. Her voice sounded strained and exhausted as she apologized for contacting me, despite knowing I'd requested no communication with family members. She explained that she was calling because the family situation had deteriorated dramatically, and she thought I deserved to know what was happening. According to Diana, Madison's marriage to Jake was falling apart in spectacular fashion. The crisis had begun when Jake discovered discrepancies in their family finances that led him to investigate Madison's spending habits and financial management more thoroughly. What he found was a pattern of lies, manipulation, and financial irresponsibility that had been hidden beneath Madison's carefully maintained facade of domestic success. The first red flag had emerged when Jake realized that Madison had been spending money designated for utility bills and mortgage payments on shopping trips and spa treatments. Bills were going unpaid while Madison continued her lifestyle of frequent retail therapy and expensive self-care services. When Jake confronted her about the missing money, Madison initially claimed there had been banking errors and misunderstandings about their account balances. However, Jake's deeper investigation revealed that Madison had been systematically deceiving him about their financial obligations and spending priorities. She'd been opening credit cards in both of their names without his knowledge, running up significant debt to fund her lifestyle, while telling him their finances were stable and well managed. The situation escalated when Jake discovered that Madison had been forging his signature on checks and financial documents. She'd been accessing his business accounts to transfer money for her personal use, essentially stealing from the construction company where Jake worked as a project manager. The theft had been disguised as legitimate business expenses, but Jake's employer had started asking questions about unusual transactions that didn't match any actual business activities. Diana explained that Madison's financial crimes had put Jake's career in jeopardy because his employer was considering whether to press charges for the missing funds. Jake was facing the possibility of losing his job and potentially facing criminal prosecution for theft he hadn't actually committed but couldn't easily prove he hadn't authorized. The marriage crisis was compounded by Jake's discovery of Madison's lies about the babysitting arrangements with me. When he'd asked Madison how they could afford frequent date nights and weekend getaways without childcare expenses, she'd told him that I volunteered my time out of love for the family and didn't want payment for helping with the children. Jake had only recently learned about Madison charging her friends for my babysitting services, while telling him I provided free childcare out of family loyalty. He was horrified to realize that his wife had been profiting from my labor while lying to him about the financial arrangements and my willingness to provide unpaid services. The revelation about my unpaid weekend babysitting duties had led Jake to calculate exactly how much Madison's lifestyle had been subsidized by my free labor. When he realized that they'd been able to enjoy expensive social activities every weekend because I was providing childcare worth hundreds of dollars per month, he began questioning every aspect of Madison's integrity and honesty. Diana revealed that Jake was now threatening divorce and seeking full custody of Emma, Ethan, and baby Sophia. He'd consulted with lawyers about protecting his assets and removing Madison's access to his financial accounts. The legal proceedings were moving quickly because Jake's attorney had advised him to act decisively to minimize his liability for Madison's financial crimes. The impact on Richard had been devastating, as Diana described it. My father was scrambling to manage multiple crises while trying to maintain his own business obligations. Madison's theft from Jake's employer had created liability issues that potentially affected Richard's financial guarantees and co-signing arrangements for Madison's various accounts and loans. More troubling was Diana's revelation that Madison had been forging Richard's signature on checks from his business account as well. The theft had been ongoing for months, with Madison taking money intended for business expenses and using it to fund her shopping and entertainment habits. Richard's accountant had discovered the missing funds during a routine audit, creating potential legal and tax complications that threatened his business's stability. Diana explained that Richard was facing demands from his business partners to explain the missing money and demonstrate that he hadn't been stealing from the company himself. The situation was complicated by the fact that Madison had been careful to forge his signature accurately and had accessed accounts through legitimate channels, making it difficult to prove that Richard hadn't authorized the transactions. The financial pressure was compounded by Richard's ongoing secret support of Madison's lifestyle, which Diana was only now learning had been much more extensive than she'd realized. The monthly mortgage payments, car loans, and household allowances that Richard had been providing to Madison totaled several $1,000s per month, representing a significant drain on his resources that had been hidden from Diana throughout their marriage. Without my free weekend childcare services, Madison had been forced to hire professional babysitters to maintain her social schedule. The cost of paid childcare had created additional financial strain that made Madison's budget shortfalls more apparent and urgent. Diana estimated that my unpaid babysitting had been worth at least $800 per month in childcare expenses that Madison no longer had available for other spending. The crisis was affecting Diana's own marriage to Richard as she struggled to understand how her husband had been secretly funding her daughter's lifestyle while claiming they needed to be careful about their own expenses. She was questioning whether Richard's favoritism toward Madison had been influencing financial decisions that affected their shared future security and retirement planning. Diana admitted that she was considering separation from Richard because she couldn't trust his judgment about money and family relationships. The revelation that he'd been enabling Madison's irresponsible behavior while refusing to help me with basic needs like student loans had created resentment and disappointment that was damaging their marriage. Most painfully for Diana, she was watching her grandchildren suffer as their parents' marriage disintegrated around them. Emma and Ethan were confused and upset by the constant fighting and tension in their household. Baby Sophia was showing signs of stress from the unstable environment and lack of consistent caregiving routines. Diana's phone call ended with her expressing regret about not supporting me when I'd tried to establish boundaries with Madison months earlier. She realized now that I'd been protecting myself from a situation that was much more toxic and unsustainable than anyone had understood at the time. My decision to cut contact had ultimately been vindicated by events that proved Madison's character and behavior were fundamentally problematic. The weeks following Diana's revelation about the family crisis brought a flood of desperate attempts from my father and Madison to rebuild contact with me. The approaches were manipulative and transparent, alternating between fake remorse and angry accusations as they realized that their carefully constructed system of favoritism and exploitation was collapsing without my unpaid labor and silent acceptance of their treatment. Richard began leaving voicemails on my new phone number, which he'd apparently obtained through persistent detective work or mutual acquaintances. His messages started with formal apologies about being too harsh during our last conversation, gradually escalating to desperate pleas for forgiveness and assistance. He claimed that he was finally beginning to understand my perspective and wanted the opportunity to make amends for his mistakes in judgment. The early voicemails focused on Richard's assertion that families should stick together during difficult times, regardless of past conflicts or misunderstandings. He suggested that the current crisis with Madison proved how much the family needed my stability and level-headed approach to problem solving. According to Richard, I was the responsible one who could help guide everyone through this challenging period if I was willing to set aside my anger and resentment. As the family situation deteriorated further, Richard's messages became more specific about the financial and legal troubles they were facing. He admitted that Madison had made serious mistakes with money and relationships, but argued that abandoning her during her darkest hour would make me no better than the people who had hurt me in the past. He appealed to my sense of compassion and family loyalty, suggesting that true strength meant helping people even when they hadn't earned or deserved that assistance. Madison's attempts at reconciliation were even more dramatic and manipulative. She created new social media accounts under variations of her name to circumvent the blocks I'd established on her main profiles. These accounts were used to send long messages that combined theatrical apologies with subtle accusations about my role in the family's current problems. Her messages claimed that losing my support and friendship had been a wake-up call that helped her recognize how much she'd taken my kindness for granted. Madison wrote eloquently about missing our relationship and regretting the misunderstandings that had driven us apart. She promised that things would be different if I gave her another chance to prove that she could be the sister I deserved. However, Madison's apologies were undermined by her simultaneous attempts to blame me for abandoning the family during their time of greatest need. She suggested that my decision to cut contact had created additional stress and instability that contributed to her marriage problems and financial difficulties. According to Madison, a truly loving family member would have worked through their grievances instead of walking away when things became challenging. The manipulation tactics became more sophisticated as Madison began using her children as emotional leverage. She sent photos of Emma, Ethan, and baby Sophia, along with messages about how much they miss their Aunt Pauline, and asked when I would come visit again. The children had apparently been coached to draw pictures and write notes expressing their love and confusion about my absence from their lives. One particularly manipulative message included a video of 4-year-old Emma crying and asking why Aunt Pauline didn't love them anymore. Madison's voice could be heard off camera, prompting Emma to say specific phrases about missing me and not understanding why I'd stopped visiting. The emotional manipulation was transparent and cruel, using innocent children's genuine confusion to try to guilt me into resuming contact. Diana served as an unwilling intermediary for many of these reconciliation attempts. Richard and Madison pressured her to call me with updates about family developments and requests for me to reconsider my decision to maintain no contact. Diana was clearly uncomfortable with this role but felt obligated to relay their messages while also trying to respect the boundaries I'd established. Through Diana, I learned that other family members had been recruited to the campaign to bring me back into the fold. Aunts, uncles, and cousins were being told selective versions of our conflict that portrayed me as stubborn and unforgiving, rather than someone who had been exploited and manipulated. These relatives began reaching out with their own messages about the importance of family forgiveness and unity during difficult times. The pressure campaign intensified when Richard began making veiled threats about my future relationship with potential nieces and nephews if Marcus and I decided to have children. He suggested that cutting myself off from my current family would create a pattern of isolation that would affect my ability to maintain stable relationships throughout my life. According to Richard, children needed extended family connections, and my future offspring would suffer from my inability to maintain healthy family relationships. Madison's approach became more aggressive as her legal and financial troubles mounted. She accused me of being vindictive and cruel for refusing to help during her darkest hour, claiming that I was enjoying watching her life fall apart as revenge for imagined slights. Her messages suggested that I had orchestrated the entire crisis by withdrawing my support at the moment when she needed family assistance most desperately. The most disturbing development came when Madison began showing up at places where she thought she might encounter me. She appeared at the coffee shop where I sometimes worked, the gym, where I had a membership, and even the grocery store near my apartment building. These surprise visits were designed to create opportunities for dramatic public confrontations, where she could appeal to my sympathy while making me look heartless for refusing to engage. During one of these ambush encounters, Madison approached me in the parking lot of my grocery store with baby Sophia in her arms. She launched into a tearful speech about how much she'd learned from her mistakes and how desperately she needed my guidance to become a better person. When I politely but firmly told her that I wasn't interested in resuming contact, she accused me of being cold and heartless toward an innocent baby who loved me. The manipulation reached its peak when Madison claimed that her children were suffering psychological damage from my absence and that I was partially responsible for their trauma. She suggested that Emma and Ethan were having nightmares and behavioral problems because they couldn't understand why their favorite aunt had abandoned them without explanation. According to Madison, I had a moral obligation to at least explain to the children why I no longer wanted to be part of their lives. My therapist helped me recognize these reconciliation attempts as classic patterns of manipulation, designed to pull me back into the toxic family system. The alternating between apologies and accusations, the use of children as emotional leverage, and the attempts to make me feel responsible for consequences of their own actions were all predictable tactics used by people who had lost control over someone they'd been exploiting. The most significant moment in this period came when Marcus proposed to me during a romantic dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first official date. As he presented the engagement ring and spoke about wanting to build a life together based on mutual respect and genuine love, I realized how much my decision to prioritize healthy relationships had transformed my entire future. The proposal represented everything I'd been missing in my family relationships: genuine appreciation for who I was as a person, respect for my goals and boundaries, and commitment to building something together rather than one person serving another's needs. Marcus had never asked me to sacrifice my career, my friendships, or my personal interests to prove my love or loyalty. Instead, he supported my growth and independence as fundamental aspects of what made our relationship strong and sustainable. The contrast between Marcus's authentic love and my family's conditional acceptance became even more apparent as the reconciliation attempts continued. While Marcus encouraged my decision to maintain healthy boundaries and prioritize my own well-being, my family demanded that I sacrifice those boundaries to prove my worthiness of their affection and acceptance. The full extent of Madison's financial crimes became apparent in late spring when Richard's business accountant completed a comprehensive audit that had been demanded by his partners and potential creditors. What they discovered was a systematic pattern of theft that went far beyond the isolated incidents Diana had initially described. Madison had been stealing from Richard's construction business for over 18 months, forging signatures and manipulating records with a sophistication that suggested careful planning rather than impulsive mistakes. The missing funds totaled nearly $40,000, representing money that had been designated for equipment purchases, employee payroll, and vendor payments. Madison had been accessing business accounts through legitimate channels by copying Richard's signature style and using knowledge of company procedures she'd gained through family conversations about his work. The theft had been disguised as routine business expenses, making it difficult to detect until the accountant noticed patterns that didn't match actual business activities. Richard's business partners were furious when they learned about the missing money and demanded immediate repayment along with Richard's resignation from active management of the company. They threatened criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits if the stolen funds weren't restored within 30 days. The ultimatum forced Richard to liquidate his personal retirement savings and take out a second mortgage on his house to cover the missing money and legal fees. The financial pressure was compounded by the discovery that Madison had also been forging Richard's signature on personal checks and credit applications. She'd opened several credit cards using his information and had been making cash advances that she'd hidden by intercepting mail and managing online account access. The identity theft added another layer of legal complexity that required expensive attorney consultation and credit monitoring services. Jake's divorce proceedings moved forward aggressively as his lawyer gathered evidence of Madison's financial crimes and deceptive behavior. The documentation included bank records showing unauthorized transfers, forged signatures on legal documents, and evidence of the secret babysitting business, where Madison had been profiting from my unpaid labor. Jake's attorney used this evidence to argue that Madison was unfit for joint custody and that her children would be better protected under his sole guardianship. The custody battle revealed additional disturbing information about Madison's parenting practices and relationship with reality. Jake's lawyer presented evidence that Madison had been coaching the children to make false statements about their living situation, their relationship with me, and their father's behavior. The manipulation extended to teaching Emma and Ethan to repeat specific phrases that would support Madison's version of events during custody evaluations and court proceedings. Child psychologists who evaluated the family situation noted that the children showed signs of emotional confusion and stress related to their mother's inconsistent messages about family relationships and responsibilities. Emma and Ethan had been told different versions of why I was no longer part of their lives, ranging from claims that I was too busy with work to suggestions that I didn't love them anymore. The conflicting explanations had created anxiety and behavioral problems that required professional intervention. Baby Sophia's development had been affected by the unstable household environment and Madison's increasing emotional volatility as her legal troubles mounted. The 18-month-old showed signs of attachment difficulties and regression in developmental milestones that concerned pediatric specialists. The stress of constant fighting and financial uncertainty had disrupted her sleep patterns and feeding routines in ways that required careful management and consistency. The investigation into Jake's workplace theft revealed that Madison had been more sophisticated in her financial crimes than anyone had initially realized. She'd been studying his work patterns and business procedures for months to understand how to access company accounts without triggering immediate detection. The planning involved showed a level of premeditation that made her actions felony charges rather than misdemeanor financial mismanagement. Jake's employer decided to press criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, partly to protect the company's reputation and partly to demonstrate that employee theft would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The charges carried potential jail time of 3 to 7 years, depending on the total amount stolen and Madison's criminal history. The legal proceedings would be public record, adding humiliation and social consequences to the financial and legal penalties. Richard's business reputation in the construction industry suffered significant damage as word spread about the missing funds and family legal troubles. Potential clients began questioning his judgment and financial management capabilities, leading to canceled contracts and reduced bidding opportunities. The company that had taken him decades to build was facing potential bankruptcy due to Madison's theft and the resulting legal complications. The Internal Revenue Service became involved when discrepancies in business expense reporting were discovered during the audit process. Madison's theft had been partially disguised as legitimate business deductions, creating tax liability issues that required professional accounting assistance and potential penalty payments. The IRS investigation added federal implications to what had started as family financial mismanagement. Diana filed for legal separation from Richard in June, unable to handle the stress and embarrassment of her daughter's criminal behavior and her husband's enabling financial support. She discovered that Richard had been secretly borrowing against their shared assets to fund Madison's lifestyle, putting Diana's own retirement security at risk without her knowledge or consent. The betrayal of trust had damaged their marriage beyond repair. The separation proceedings revealed the full extent of Richard's secret financial support for Madison over the years. Diana's attorney calculated that Richard had provided over $200,000 in direct support loan guarantees and financial assistance since Madison's wedding. The money had come from accounts and investments that Diana had assumed were being saved for their retirement and future security. The house that Richard and Diana had shared for 15 years went on the market as part of the financial restructuring required to pay legal fees and restore stolen business funds. The forced sale meant that Richard would lose most of his remaining equity and would need to find rental housing at age 62 while trying to rebuild his damaged business reputation and depleted savings. Madison's legal troubles escalated when additional victims of her financial manipulation came forward during the criminal investigation. Several of her friends revealed that she'd borrowed money under false pretenses, claiming family emergencies and financial hardships that didn't actually exist. The pattern of deception included forged documents and fabricated stories designed to elicit sympathy and financial assistance from multiple sources. The mounting evidence of systematic fraud and manipulation painted a picture of someone whose relationship with honesty and reality had become seriously distorted. Madison's lawyer advised her to consider a plea bargain that would involve restitution payments and supervised probation, rather than risking a trial that could result in significant prison time. The legal strategy required admitting guilt and accepting responsibility for actions that Madison had been denying and minimizing throughout the investigation. Richard's desperate phone calls to me increased in frequency as his financial and legal situation deteriorated. His voicemails revealed the full scope of the crisis and included specific details about how much money was needed to prevent bankruptcy and criminal prosecution. He begged me to consider providing financial assistance or character testimony that might help mitigate the legal consequences for Madison and preserve what remained of the family's reputation and assets. The irony wasn't lost on me that Richard was now asking for help from the daughter he'd disowned for refusing to provide unpaid babysitting services. The man who had told me I was selfish and ungrateful was now desperately seeking assistance from someone he'd cut off completely when I'd established basic boundaries about being exploited. His pleas for financial help came from someone who had refused to assist with my student loans while secretly funding Madison's entire lifestyle. The most devastating revelation came when Richard offered to sign over his life insurance policy to me as compensation for past mistreatment and as security for any financial assistance I might provide. The gesture revealed how completely his world had collapsed and how desperate he'd become to find any source of help or forgiveness. The man who had once held ultimate authority over family relationships was now begging for acceptance from the daughter he'd rejected. By late summer, Richard's situation had become truly desperate as the legal and financial consequences of Madison's actions continued to cascade through every aspect of his life. The business he'd spent 30 years building was facing bankruptcy proceedings. His marriage to Diana was ending in divorce, and he was living in a small studio apartment after losing the family home to foreclosure. At 62 years old, he was working part-time at a hardware store to pay for basic living expenses while trying to manage multiple lawsuits and criminal proceedings. The phone call that changed everything came on a humid Thursday evening in August. Richard's voice sounded broken and aged in a way that shocked me, despite months of knowing about his troubles. He'd obtained my new number through Diana, who had reluctantly agreed to provide it after Richard convinced her that he needed to make a formal apology and attempt at reconciliation before his legal situation became even worse. Richard began the conversation by taking full responsibility for his treatment of me over the years, and specifically for the ultimatum that had ended our relationship. He acknowledged that I'd been right about Madison's character and behavior, and that his favoritism and enabling had created the monster who had ultimately destroyed his life and business. The admission was painful to hear because it validated everything I'd tried to tell him months earlier when he'd refused to listen. He explained that losing his business and home had given him perspective on what truly mattered in life, and that he'd realized too late how much he'd valued the wrong priorities and relationships. According to Richard, I had been the loyal and responsible daughter all along, while Madison had been using his love and support to fund a lifestyle built on lies and exploitation. He'd been blind to her manipulation because he'd wanted so desperately to believe in the perfect family he thought he'd created. The most heartbreaking part of his confession involved his recognition of how differently he'd treated his two daughters throughout our childhood and young adulthood. Richard admitted that he'd given Madison opportunities, financial support, and emotional validation that he'd withheld from me based on assumptions about our potential and worthiness. He'd somehow convinced himself that I was stronger and more independent, therefore needing less support, while Madison required extra help to reach her potential. Richard revealed that Diana's decision to leave him had been the final wake-up call about how his enabling and favoritism had damaged everyone in the family, including Madison herself. Diana had pointed out that his refusal to let Madison face consequences for her actions had prevented her from developing the character and judgment skills she needed to be a successful adult. His overprotection had actually handicapped Madison, while his neglect had forced me to develop resilience and independence. The conversation took an even more painful turn when Richard described his current living situation and the reality of starting over at his age with no savings damage credit and a criminal record associated with his name through Madison's crimes. He was working 20 hours per week at a hardware store for minimum wage, living in a studio apartment with shared bathroom facilities, and eating most of his meals from dollar store canned goods and instant noodles. His former business partners had pursued every legal avenue to recover their losses, leaving Richard with garnished wages and liens against any future assets he might acquire. The The bankruptcy proceedings had eliminated most of his debt, but also destroyed his credit rating and professional reputation in the construction industry. At 62, he was essentially starting his financial life over from zero while dealing with health issues related to stress and poor nutrition. Madison was facing an 18-month prison sentence after accepting a plea bargain that required full restitution to all victims of her financial crimes. The payment schedule would extend for 10 years beyond her release date, meaning that any income she earned would be partially garnished to repay the money she'd stolen. Jake had been awarded sole custody of the children, and Madison would have only supervised visitation rights upon her release from prison. The children were struggling with the loss of their mother and the dramatic change in their living situation, though Jake was providing them with counseling and stability that they'd never experienced during Madison's chaotic parenting. Emma and Ethan were slowly learning to tell the truth about their feelings and experiences instead of repeating coached responses designed to manipulate adults. Baby Sophia was thriving under Jake's consistent care and structured routines. Richard's voice broke as he described visiting the children at Jake's new house across town and seeing how much happier and more secure they seemed without Madison's constant drama and manipulation. Emma had stopped asking when Mommy was coming home and instead talked excitedly about activities with Daddy and their new babysitter, who treated childcare as a professional responsibility rather than an opportunity for exploitation. The reason for Richard's call became clear when he asked if I could find it in my heart to forgive him enough to let him attend my wedding to Marcus, which he'd learned about through Diana's ongoing contact with me. He wanted the opportunity to walk me down the aisle as a gesture of reconciliation and to demonstrate to everyone that he finally recognized my worth and loved me as his daughter. The request was both touching and complicated, given the months of no contact and the pain of his earlier rejection. Richard offered to sign over his life insurance policy to me, regardless of whether I agreed to reconciliation, saying that it was the only asset he had left to offer as compensation for years of mistreatment and favoritism. The policy had a $50,000 benefit that would come to me upon his death, which he hoped would provide some financial security and demonstrate his genuine remorse for past mistakes. He promised to attend therapy and work on understanding the enabling behaviors and favoritism that had created such toxic family dynamics. Richard acknowledged that rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time rather than words or grand gestures, and that I had every right to maintain boundaries while deciding whether to allow him back into my life gradually. The conversation ended with Richard expressing hope that someday his grandchildren might know me as their aunt, since Jake had indicated willingness to maintain family connections that were healthy and positive for the children's development. Richard wanted the opportunity to tell Emma, Ethan, and Sophia about their wonderful aunt, who had tried to protect them from their mother's manipulation, even though they'd been too young to understand what was happening at the time. After hanging up, I sat with Marcus and processed the complex emotions that Richard's call had stirred up. Part of me felt vindicated that he finally understood the truth about Madison and the family dynamics I'd been trying to explain for years. Another part of me felt sad about the price he'd paid for learning these lessons and the years we'd lost due to his stubborn favoritism and refusal to listen to my perspective. Marcus supported whatever decision I wanted to make about reconciliation, but encouraged me to take time to think through the implications carefully. We discussed the difference between forgiveness and resuming relationship and whether it was possible to have compassion for Richard's situation while still protecting myself from potential future manipulation or disappointment. The most significant factor in my decision-making process was recognizing how much my life had improved since cutting contact with the toxic family dynamics. I was successful, professionally happy in my relationship, and surrounded by people who respected my boundaries and valued my contributions. Allowing Richard back into my life would need to enhance, rather than threaten, the stability and happiness I'd worked so hard to build. After several weeks of careful consideration and multiple therapy sessions, I decided to meet with Richard under very specific conditions that would protect my emotional well-being, while allowing the possibility of gradual reconciliation. The meeting was scheduled to take place at my therapist's office with her present as a neutral mediator who could help facilitate healthy communication and intervene if the conversation became manipulative or harmful. I prepared for the meeting by writing down the specific boundaries and expectations I needed to communicate clearly. These included absolute prohibition on discussing Madison unless I brought up the topic, no requests for financial assistance or favors of any kind, and no guilt trips about family loyalty or obligations. Any future relationship would need to be built slowly through consistent, respectful behavior rather than dramatic gestures or promises. Richard arrived at the therapy office looking older and more worn down than I'd expected, but also more humble and genuine than I'd seen him in years. The expensive clothes and confident demeanor that had characterized his successful businessman persona had been replaced by thrift store clothing and a quieter, more thoughtful way of speaking. The external changes reflected internal shifts that seemed more authentic than his previous approaches to our relationship. The session began with Richard offering a comprehensive apology that demonstrated genuine understanding of how his favoritism and ultimatum had affected me. He didn't make excuses or blame his behavior on stress or misunderstanding, but instead took full responsibility for choosing to prioritize Madison's demands over my legitimate needs and boundaries. The apology felt sincere because it focused on his actions rather than my reactions or feelings. My therapist helped facilitate a conversation about specific incidents and patterns that had damaged our relationship over the years. Richard was able to acknowledge concrete examples of differential treatment between Madison and me, including financial support, emotional validation, and expectations for service, without compensation. He recognized that his enabling had been harmful to Madison as well as unfair to me. I explained to Richard that any future relationship would need to respect my independence and my commitment to my life with Marcus. I wasn't interested in becoming a surrogate daughter who filled the gap left by Madison's absence, nor did I want to be asked to provide advice or assistance with family problems that stemmed from years of enabling behavior. Our relationship would need to be about genuine mutual respect rather than guilt or obligation. Richard agreed to attend individual therapy to work on the controlling and enabling behaviors that had created such destructive family dynamics. He acknowledged that he needed professional help to understand why he'd been drawn to relationships where he could control others through financial support and emotional manipulation. The therapy commitment would be ongoing rather than a short-term fix designed to win back my approval. The conversation about my upcoming wedding to Marcus provided an opportunity to establish clear expectations about Richard's role in my life going forward. I explained that while I was willing to consider allowing him to attend the ceremony, he wouldn't automatically be walking me down the aisle or playing a traditional father role. Those privileges would need to be earned through months of respectful behavior and demonstrated change. I also made it clear that my new family with Marcus was my primary priority and that I wouldn't sacrifice my marriage or happiness to accommodate Richard's emotional needs or desires for family reconciliation. If he wanted to be part of my life, he would need to respect my choices and boundaries rather than trying to influence or control my decisions through guilt or manipulation. The topic of Madison and her children was addressed directly with firm boundaries about what I was and wasn't willing to discuss or participate in. I told Richard that I had no interest in providing support advice or assistance related to Madison's legal troubles, financial problems, or parenting challenges. I also wouldn't be accepting any communication from Madison herself, regardless of the circumstances or her expressed desire for reconciliation. Regarding the children, I explained that while I felt sorry for Emma, Ethan, and baby Sophia, I wasn't willing to resume any kind of aunt relationship that might create opportunities for Madison to manipulate me through them. If the children were truly interested in knowing me as adults, they could reach out independently when they were old enough to make their own decisions about family relationships. Richard's offer to sign over his life insurance policy was declined because I didn't want our reconciliation to be based on financial arrangements or inheritances that might create complicated obligations. I preferred to rebuild our relationship through respect and genuine connection rather than money or material gestures that could be used to justify future demands or expectations. The session concluded with an agreement to have supervised phone conversations once per month for 3 months, followed by re-evaluation of whether we were ready for unsupervised contact. Richard would continue his individual therapy and would provide updates about his progress without expecting praise or reassurance from me. Any violations of the agreed-upon boundaries would result in immediate resumption of no contact. 2 weeks after our therapy session, I received a shocking phone call from the county jail where Madison was being held while awaiting sentencing. She'd apparently been given permission to make a call and had chosen to reach out to me with a desperate plea that revealed just how completely her world had collapsed around her. Madison's voice sounded thin and frightened as she begged me to consider taking custody of her children when she went to prison. Jake was planning to move across the country with Emma, Ethan, and Sophia to be closer to his family and start fresh somewhere without connections to Madison's crimes and manipulation. According to Madison, I was the only family member who could provide stability and continuity for the children during this traumatic period. The request was both shocking and revealing about how little Madison understood about the consequences of her actions and the reality of our relationship. She seemed genuinely surprised that I might not be willing to sacrifice my life and marriage to care for the children she'd used as emotional leverage during her attempts at manipulation. Her assumption that I would automatically step in to solve her parenting crisis showed that she still viewed me as existing primarily to serve her needs. I gently but firmly declined Madison's request and explained that Jake was the children's father and was fully capable of providing them with the love, stability, and honest relationships they needed to heal from their traumatic experiences. I also pointed out that my refusal to resume unpaid babysitting duties months earlier had been about protecting myself from exploitation, not about rejecting the children personally. Madison's response revealed that she still hadn't accepted responsibility for the destruction her lies and manipulation had caused. She accused me of being vindictive and cruel for refusing to help innocent children who were suffering because of circumstances beyond their control. According to Madison, a truly loving family member would put the children's needs ahead of personal grudges and resentments. The phone call ended with me explaining that the children would be better off with their father who loved them unconditionally, rather than with an aunt who would constantly remind them of their mother's failures and crimes. Jake could provide them with honest relationships and healthy boundaries that would help them develop into trustworthy adults rather than continuing the cycle of manipulation and enabling that had characterized their early childhood. After hanging up, I felt a sense of peace about maintaining my boundaries, even in the face of Madison's desperate manipulation attempts. The conversation had confirmed that she remained fundamentally unchanged in her willingness to use her children as tools for getting what she wanted from others. My decision to prioritize my own well-being and marriage had been validated by her continued attempts to make me responsible for solving problems she'd created through her own choices. 6 months after beginning the careful reconciliation process with Richard Marcus, and I planned a small wedding ceremony that reflected our values of authenticity, intimacy, and genuine celebration, rather than elaborate displays or family politics. We chose a beautiful outdoor venue in the mountains outside Denver, where we could exchange vows surrounded by close friends and the family members who had consistently supported our relationship and individual growth. The guest list was intentionally small, including only people who had shown genuine care and respect for both of us as individuals and as a couple. Marcus's parents and siblings were excited to welcome me into their family, having gotten to know me over months of relaxed dinners and holiday celebrations, where I felt valued and appreciated for who I actually was, rather than what services I could provide. Diana attended the wedding after her divorce from Richard was finalized, representing the complicated but ultimately positive outcome of her decision to leave an enabling relationship and build a more authentic life. She'd been consistently supportive of my boundary setting and had worked hard to repair the damage caused by her daughter's manipulation and her own previous silence about problematic behaviors she'd witnessed. Richard's attendance at the ceremony was the result of months of demonstrated change in his behavior and approach to our relationship. He'd consistently respected the boundaries I'd established, attended his therapy sessions faithfully, and shown genuine interest in my happiness rather than trying to control or influence my decisions. His presence felt appropriate rather than obligatory or dramatic. The ceremony itself was beautiful and meaningful, focusing on the commitment Marcus and I were making to support each other's growth and happiness throughout our shared future. Our vows reflected the lessons we'd both learned about the importance of choosing relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and our determination to build a family culture based on honesty and authentic connection. Richard's behavior during the wedding festivities demonstrated how much he'd learned about healthy family relationships through his therapy and the consequences of his previous enabling patterns. He congratulated Marcus warmly and spoke genuinely about his happiness for our future together, rather than making the event about his own emotional needs or desire for forgiveness and reconciliation. During the reception, Richard had a brief conversation with Jake, who had driven down from Colorado Springs, where he was building a new life with Emma, Ethan, and Sophia. Jake expressed gratitude for my decision to protect myself from Madison's manipulation, explaining that my absence had ultimately forced everyone to see the true extent of her problems and get the children the help and stability they needed. The conversation with Jake was particularly meaningful because it confirmed that my choice to establish boundaries had benefited everyone involved, including the children I genuinely cared about, but couldn't help in the ways Madison had demanded. Emma and Ethan were thriving in their new school and had developed trusting relationships with a professional babysitter who treated childcare as a job rather than an opportunity for emotional manipulation. Baby Sophia, now 2 years old, had no memory of the chaotic household dynamics that had characterized her early months. She was developing normally under Jake's consistent parenting and had formed secure attachments that would serve her well throughout her childhood. The stability and honesty in their new life was exactly what all 3 children had needed to heal from their early traumatic experiences. Marcus and I spent our honeymoon in Ireland exploring the countryside and small towns while talking about our hopes and dreams for our marriage and future family. The trip felt like a perfect symbol of the authentic, adventure-filled partnership we'd built together based on genuine compatibility rather than obligation or convenience. The contrast between our relationship and the family dynamics I'd escaped was particularly clear during quiet moments when we could talk honestly about our feelings, goals, and concerns without worrying about manipulation or hidden agendas. Marcus supported my career ambitions and encouraged my independence while also sharing his own vulnerabilities and dreams for our shared future. We returned from our honeymoon to discover that my graphic design business had continued to grow through referrals and repeat clients who appreciated my professionalism and creative solutions. The success felt particularly meaningful because it had been built through genuine competence and relationship building rather than family connections or exploiting others' labor and goodwill. The elite design agency position I'd been offered provided the perfect opportunity to expand my skills while maintaining the independence and financial security I'd worked so hard to achieve. The job came with excellent benefits, opportunities for professional development, and colleagues who valued collaboration and mutual respect rather than hierarchy based on favoritism or manipulation. Our first year of marriage was filled with small adventures and quiet domestic happiness that felt like a gift after years of family drama and exploitation. We took weekend hiking trips, tried new restaurants, attended concerts and art exhibits, and spent lazy Sunday mornings reading the newspaper and planning home improvement projects for the house we'd purchased together. The house itself represented everything I'd hoped to build in my life, a beautiful space that reflected our shared values and individual personalities, filled with furniture and artwork we'd chosen together rather than inherited obligations or guilt-inducing gifts from family members. The guest room was designed for friends who respected our boundaries rather than relatives who expected free services or emotional labor. Richard's continued progress in therapy and his respectful approach to our rebuilding relationship provided evidence that people can change when they're willing to do the hard work of examining their destructive patterns and taking responsibility for the harm they've caused. Our monthly phone conversations were genuine exchanges rather than opportunities for manipulation or emotional dumping. The most touching moment of our first year came when Richard sent a Christmas card that simply said he was proud of the life I'd built and grateful for the opportunity to witness my happiness from a respectful distance. The message acknowledged my independence and success rather than trying to take credit for my achievements or insert himself into my accomplishments. Diana's friendship had become an unexpected source of support and encouragement as she built her own independent life after leaving her enabling marriage. Our conversations about setting boundaries and prioritizing authentic relationships helped both of us continue growing in our understanding of healthy family dynamics and self-respect. The peace and stability of my new life felt almost miraculous after years of constant family crisis and emotional manipulation. Waking up next to Marcus every morning and knowing that our day would be filled with mutual support and genuine affection, rather than demands for unpaid services or emotional management, felt like living in a completely different world. 2 years into my marriage with Marcus, our life together had developed into exactly the kind of partnership I'd always hoped to find but had never experienced before escaping the toxic family dynamics that had dominated my early adulthood. My graphic design business had grown into a small agency with 3 employees and a steady roster of high-profile clients who valued our creative solutions and professional reliability. The success felt particularly meaningful because it had been built entirely through my own efforts and the support of people who genuinely believed in my capabilities. Without weekend babysitting obligations consuming my time and energy, I'd been able to attend networking events, pursue continuing education opportunities, and develop the business relationships that had transformed my freelance work into a thriving company. Marcus and I had settled into comfortable routines that balanced our individual career goals with shared domestic happiness and adventure. He'd been promoted to assistant principal at his elementary school, a position that utilized his natural leadership skills and deep commitment to children's education and well-being. His success felt like a natural result of his dedication, rather than favoritism or manipulation. Our house had become a gathering place for friends who appreciated our hospitality and respected our boundaries. We hosted dinner parties where conversation flowed naturally, and guests contributed to meal preparation and cleanup without being asked. The contrast with family gatherings where I'd been expected to provide all the labor while others enjoyed the benefits was striking and refreshing. The most exciting development came when we discovered that I was pregnant with our first child. The news filled us both with joy and anticipation for building the kind of family culture we'd both dreamed about, one based on mutual respect, honest communication, and love that wasn't conditional on performance or service to others' needs. Planning for our baby's arrival gave us opportunities to discuss our values and priorities as future parents. We talked about the importance of raising children who understood that family love should be freely given rather than earned through compliance or service. Our child would grow up knowing that their worth wasn't dependent on their usefulness to others or their willingness to sacrifice their own needs for family harmony. Richard's relationship with us continued to improve slowly as he demonstrated consistent respect for our boundaries and genuine happiness about our success, rather than attempts to insert himself into our achievements. When we told him about the pregnancy, his response was purely celebratory without any suggestions about how he might be involved or what role he expected to play in his grandchild's life. The conversation about grandparent relationships led to important discussions about how we wanted to approach extended family connections for our children. We decided that any family relationships would need to be based on the same principles of mutual respect and authenticity that governed our marriage, with no tolerance for manipulation or exploitation disguised as family loyalty. Diana's excitement about becoming a step-grandmother was touching and appropriate, focused on our happiness rather than her own emotional needs or desires for involvement. She'd learned through her own therapy and life changes to appreciate family relationships that enhanced rather than complicated people's lives, understanding that love should feel supportive rather than burdensome. My business expansion required hiring additional staff, and the process of interviewing and training employees gave me insights into healthy workplace dynamics that contrasted sharply with the family exploitation I'd experienced. Professional relationships based on clear expectations, fair compensation, and mutual benefit felt natural and sustainable in ways that family obligations never had. The financial security from my successful business and Marcus's steady teaching salary allowed us to purchase a larger house in a neighborhood with excellent schools and family-friendly amenities. The move represented our growing confidence in our ability to build the kind of life we wanted rather than accepting whatever circumstances other people created for us. Our new neighbors were friendly couples and families who respected privacy, while also creating a sense of community through voluntary participation in block parties and neighborhood improvement projects. The relationships developed organically based on shared interests and compatible lifestyles rather than obligation or geographical proximity alone. Marcus's family welcomed our growing family with the same warmth and authenticity they'd always shown, offering practical help and emotional support without strings attached or hidden agendas. His parents bought thoughtful baby gifts and offered to help with childcare when needed, but never demanded specific roles or access that would create obligations or complications. The contrast between healthy family support and the exploitation I'd escaped became even more apparent as we prepared for parenthood. Marcus's relatives offered assistance that enhanced our lives rather than creating additional burdens or expectations. Their involvement felt like a gift rather than a transaction that would need to be repaid through future service or compliance. 6 months into my pregnancy, I received unexpected news that Madison was being released from prison early due to good behavior and overcrowding in the correctional system. Her release didn't create anxiety or concern for me because I'd built such strong boundaries and supportive relationships that her attempts at renewed contact couldn't threaten the stability I'd created. Diana called to let me know about Madison's release and to assure me that she had no intention of facilitating any communication or reconciliation attempts. Madison would be living in a halfway house across the state while completing her parole requirements, and Jake had moved even further away to ensure that the children's lives wouldn't be disrupted by her return to freedom. The news about Madison's release actually reinforced my sense of gratitude for the choices I'd made to prioritize my own well-being and build authentic relationships. While she was starting over with the consequences of her manipulative and criminal behavior, I was thriving in a life built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine love. Our baby shower was a beautiful celebration attended by friends and chosen family members who were excited to support our growing family. The gifts were thoughtful and practical, given out of genuine affection rather than obligation or expectation of future reciprocal generosity. The afternoon felt like a perfect example of how celebrations should work when they're based on authentic relationships. The most meaningful moment came when Richard asked privately if there was anything specific he could do to support us during the transition to parenthood. His offer was genuine and respectful, focused on our needs, rather than his desire for involvement or recognition as a helpful grandfather. The conversation felt natural and comfortable in ways that family interactions had never felt during my childhood and early adulthood. As my due date approached, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life Marcus and I had built together, and the family we were about to welcome into a home filled with stability, honesty, and unconditional love. Our child would grow up knowing that family relationships should enhance, rather than complicate life, and that love shouldn't require sacrificing personal boundaries or individual goals. Our daughter, Emma Rose, was born on a snowy February morning, arriving healthy and beautiful into the warm, loving environment Marcus and I had carefully created for our growing family. Holding her for the first time, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment of pure joy and unconditional love that asked nothing of her except her existence. The name choice was intentional and meaningful. Emma had been the name of Madison's daughter, the little girl who had been caught in the middle of adult manipulation and exploitation through no fault of her own. By giving our daughter this name, I honored the innocent child, while reclaiming it from the painful associations with family dysfunction and toxic relationships. Marcus and I had discussed the symbolism extensively during my pregnancy, recognizing that we wanted our Emma to grow up understanding that names and family connections should represent love and hope rather than obligation and exploitation. Our Emma would know from the beginning that her worth came from her inherent value as a person rather than her ability to serve others' needs or maintain family harmony through self-sacrifice. The early months of parenthood confirmed everything we'd learned about the difference between healthy family relationships and exploitative ones. Marcus's parents visited regularly to help with practical tasks like cooking and laundry, but they never overstayed their welcome or created additional burdens through their assistance. Their support enhanced our experience of new parenthood rather than complicating it with expectations or demands. Richard's approach to becoming a grandfather demonstrated how much he'd learned through therapy and the consequences of his previous enabling behaviors. He asked permission before visiting, brought practical gifts rather than elaborate displays, and focused on our needs as new parents rather than his own emotional desires for involvement in his granddaughter's life. The contrast with my memories of family dynamics during Madison's children's early years was striking. Where Madison had expected others to provide constant free assistance while she maintained her social schedule, Marcus and I shared responsibilities equally and accepted help that felt genuinely supportive rather than obligatory. Diana's relationship with Emma was purely loving and appropriate, characterized by the joy of watching a baby grow and develop, rather than any sense of entitlement to specific roles or access. Her excitement was infectious and authentic, based on genuine affection rather than attempts to fill emotional voids or create obligations for future reciprocal care. When Emma was 6 months old, I received a final communication from Madison through Diana, who reluctantly agreed to deliver a message, but made it clear that she wasn't advocating for renewed contact. Madison's letter was filled with apologies and claims about personal growth and transformation during her time in prison, along with expressions of regret about missing the opportunity to know her new niece. The letter felt like a last desperate attempt at manipulation, designed to use my new motherhood as leverage for emotional reconciliation that would ultimately benefit Madison rather than anyone else. Her focus on missing out on Emma's life revealed that she still viewed family relationships primarily in terms of what she could gain rather than what she could genuinely contribute. I chose not to respond to Madison's letter because I had no interest in exposing my daughter to the manipulation and instability that had characterized all of Madison's relationships. Emma deserved to grow up surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally, rather than those who might view her as an opportunity for emotional leverage or social rehabilitation. Marcus supported my decision completely, understanding that protecting our family's peace and stability was more important than maintaining connections with people who had proven themselves incapable of healthy relationships. Our daughter would have plenty of loving family members and friends who could provide positive role models without the complications of Madison's criminal history and manipulative tendencies. As Emma grew from infant to toddler, she thrived in an environment filled with honest communication, consistent boundaries, and love that was freely given rather than earned through compliance or service. Watching her develop her own personality and preferences without pressure to conform to others' expectations felt like healing some of the wounds from my own childhood experiences. The most profound realization came during Emma's second birthday party, surrounded by friends and chosen family members who celebrated her simply for being herself. The gathering was joyful and relaxed because everyone present was there out of genuine affection rather than obligation or social expectation. Marcus and I had created exactly the kind of family culture we dreamed about, one where love was abundant and unconditional, where individual worth wasn't dependent on usefulness to others, and where conflicts were resolved through honest communication rather than manipulation or guilt. Our daughter was growing up knowing that she was valued for who she was rather than what she could provide to others. The life lesson that emerged from my journey was both simple and profound. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to treat you with respect, even if they're family members who claim to care about you. Setting boundaries and prioritizing your own well-being isn't selfish. It's essential for building the kind of life and relationships that actually nourish your soul. My decision to cut contact with my father and Madison hadn't just saved my own life from continued exploitation and manipulation. It had forced everyone involved to confront the toxic dynamics they'd been enabling and maintaining. Richard had learned to value genuine relationships over controlling ones. Diana had found the strength to leave an unhealthy marriage and build authentic connections. Even Jake and his children had benefited from the exposure of Madison's true character and the removal of my unpaid labor that had been subsidizing her irresponsible lifestyle. The family isn't defined by blood relationships or shared history, but by mutual love, respect, and support, given freely rather than extracted through guilt or obligation. The people who truly care about your well-being will support your growth and independence rather than demanding that you sacrifice your dreams and boundaries to maintain their comfort and convenience. Marcus and I often talked about the importance of teaching Emma that she never owes anyone her time, energy, or emotional labor simply because they claim to love her or share genetic material with her. True love enhances rather than diminishes the recipient, creating space for growth and authenticity, rather than demanding compliance and service. As I watched my daughter play in our garden on a sunny spring afternoon, surrounded by the beauty and stability Marcus and I had created together, I felt grateful beyond words for the courage I'd found to prioritize my own worth and build authentic relationships. The ultimatum my father had delivered 3 years earlier had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me, but it had actually given me the push I needed to create the life I truly deserved. The women who might be listening to this story and recognizing similar patterns in their own family relationships should know that you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness rather than exploited and manipulated. Setting boundaries isn't cruel or selfish. It's an act of love for yourself and everyone around you. Sometimes walking away from toxic relationships is the only way to create space for healthy ones to flourish. Your worth isn't determined by your willingness to sacrifice your dreams and boundaries for others' convenience. You deserve relationships that celebrate your independence and success, rather than demanding that you minimize yourself to make others feel comfortable. The people who truly love you will support your growth, rather than trying to control or exploit your generosity. What's your experience with family members who seem to love you conditionally based on what you can provide for them? Have you ever had to choose between maintaining toxic relationships and protecting your own well-being? I'd love to hear your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about setting boundaries, building authentic relationships, and choosing your own happiness over others' expectations. Sharing this story with friends who might need to hear this message could help them recognize that they deserve respect and genuine love rather than manipulation disguised as family loyalty. Thank you for listening to my journey and for supporting the choice to prioritize authentic relationships over toxic obligations. I hope everyone finds the courage to build the kind of life and family culture that truly nourishes their soul and allows them to thrive as the remarkable individuals they were meant to be. Remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's the foundation for building relationships that actually deserve your love and loyalty.